I'm Madhav Rajan. I'm the Dean and the George Pratt Schultz Professor of Accounting at Chicago Booth. Before we begin, I wanted to extend my heartfelt wishes to all of you for a very happy and healthy new year. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening on a day in which we have witnessed some truly extraordinary scenes, which we can talk a little bit about as well. I'm thrilled to have all of you here as we welcome Mellody Hobson of Ariel Investments to our first virtual Distinguished Speaker Series of 2021. The DSS is a long-standing Chicago Booth tradition and brings together high-profile leaders from government, from business, and the community to the school to share their insights and experience. We started doing these events virtually way back in April when the pandemic began, and we had chats with several alumni about their company's reactions to COVID in particular, resumed the series in the fall, and had a series of some truly great DSS events, culminating with a terrific chat with Linnea Conrad Roberts and Sally Krawcheck back in December. I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker. Mellody Hobson is co-CEO of Ariel Investments. So she's responsible for management, strategic planning, and growth for all areas outside of research and portfolio management. Additionally, Mellody serves as chairman of the board of trustees of the Ariel Investment Trust, which includes the company's publicly traded mutual funds. Prior to being named co-CEO, Mellody spent nearly 2 decades as the firm's president. Outside of Ariel, Mellody is a nationally recognized voice on financial literacy. As of March, she'll be the incoming chairman of the board of Starbucks Corporation, where she's currently the vice chair. She's also a director at JP Morgan Chase. Prior to that, she served as chairman of the board of DreamWorks Animation until the company's sale. Mellody has done an incredible amount in terms of community outreach, including a role as chairman of After School Matters, a Chicago nonprofit that provides area teens with high quality after school and summer programs. Thank you very much for being with us today, Mellody.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean.
So I thought maybe we'd begin by speaking a little bit about the pandemic. What has surprised you the most about how the economy has responded to the pandemic?
I have to say that I'm most surprised by the economic resiliency that we've seen, especially in America. I think that one would have expected a much more dire outcome, not only in the stock market, but also in terms of everyday Americans. And when you look at some of the economic data, it doesn't speak to that. Now, that is not to suggest that tens of millions of people aren't suffering. So please don't think that I'm in any way discounting that. But it is, when you look at the whole and just the economic data comprehensively, I would have expected it to be way worse. There was a story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that talked about if you just look at income, the overall income for the whole US economy, it's only dropped by 0.5%. Now, part of the reason that it's dropped that it hasn't been more significant is that income has not truly been affected by people who are able to work at home and more white collar workers who are higher income workers. But even then, again, if you look back on things like the Great Depression, that would have been very different math.
Hmm. Could you speak a little bit about how the pandemic has affected Ariel particularly? Has it changed the way you think about businesses or the kinds of investments that you've made?
It doesn't change the way we think about businesses. And in fact, for us, these kind of crisis moments create tremendous investment opportunities. We do really well in trench warfare. And that's what we've been in all of 2020. And we will see how 2021 turns out. Certainly today is an example of, again, more trench warfare. But specifically, when markets really get destabilized, that allows us to shop and buy bargains. When people are running away from the building, we're running towards it, running towards the fire, and we're just picking through the wreckage where we see that there are great businesses that have been left for dead. That's what we did aggressively in March, and that has been recognized in the results that we had through the end of the year, where especially on the domestic equity side, we had very strong results. And even in the worst of the pandemic, we insulated on the downside. The other thing I'd say about the pandemic is I think it's forced us all to think about how we work. And we all want to, of course, work smarter and more efficiently. And the pandemic has really driven some of that. It's necessitated it. In many ways, you've had to cut out bureaucracy because you just don't even have, you not only don't have the time, you don't have the people, and you don't have the interactions for it to exist. So you get to the essential. And I think holding on to that is something that I really want to try to think through what we do on a going forward basis.
So you've established a reputation as a long-term investor. In your mind, are there certain industries that have been changed permanently that may never come back, do you think, to where they were before the pandemic?
I think retail is going to be very different. I think that we've seen a disruption that one expected to maybe take decades to play out in months. I saw a joke that was written and it said, who was responsible for your digital revolution at your company? Your CEO, your chief technology officer, or the pandemic? And I think this pandemic has really revolutionized the uptake specifically on online shopping. It was the train had left the station, it was already happening. But I think in America, our mall structure, we're really overbuilt versus the rest of the world. I think the number is there's something like 3,000 malls in America. And some people say that the real number should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 300, which is hard to imagine we could get down to 10%. But that was one retail leader who said that number to me. The high-end malls continue to do well, the A malls, but I think the C's are going to continue to struggle mightily and probably be repurposed as different kinds of businesses and different structures. So I really do think that the necessity that we could not go out and shop in the same way has led to some uptake that may be more permanent on a going forward basis that would really challenge retail that is not very well distinguished. I think if you have a unique concept or a unique product that you offer, even in a brick and mortar structure, I think omni-channel shopping will be more likely where you could pick it in the store or have it shipped to you, etc. But I think some of the just rank and file, not that distinguished retailers are going to continue to have a really tough time, which is just again a shame because retail and the shopping experience is a form of entertainment in our country.
You're a native Chicagoan, you call Chicago home. Is there something you could share about what you've learned about Chicago through the pandemic, and has it changed what your vision for Chicago is going forward?
If I could just add one more thing to that in terms of industries that have changed, it's really interesting to see how media is playing out, specifically as it relates to movies and entertainment and streaming. The streaming multiples that have now been put on companies like Disney and the New York Times. That is a big, big sea change, going to day and date for release, not just in theaters, but also on streaming platforms. I think we're seeing a real change in what is happening in media. And that movie-going experience on a going-forward basis, it's still unclear as to what it will be. But certainly one thing that we have learned during this period is there's no question that content remains king and content continues to be very, very, very valuable. So I think that's the other area that we're watching a real disruption in real time. It had been happening with Netflix and Amazon Prime and the like, but I think it's accelerated in a massive way, especially with some of these blockbuster tentpole releases via streaming. In terms of Chicago and what I've learned from Chicago, I've learned that leadership matters. I literally just hung up the phone with our mayor, who I have just tremendous respect for. I think she's the right leader for the right time. I think she's bold and brave, and I think she hangs on her convictions. She's not the person who's worried about the next election. She's worried about doing the right thing by our citizens. And that is something that I'm really, really grateful for when it comes to the city that I love. I think that the other thing that I've learned is that in these kind of moments where literally you're in a foxhole, you need people who can keep their heads, be calm, thoughtful, and to really move the city forward. And it was interesting. I was on the COVID recovery committee. I was co-chair of it. And she said, Mellody, think about this, the way Chicago came out of the Chicago fire, that we had this incredible opportunity to rebuild the city. If we could rebuild Chicago, what industries, what areas, what should we be doing? That is a visionary leader. So I really appreciate that she came at it with that point of view, as opposed to trying to think about how do you go back to the way things were. So many people reminisce about the good old days. I think that is dangerous, dangerous thinking.
So if I may switch a little bit, talk about corporate social responsibility, which I know is an area that you've thought a lot about. So back in September, we did an event for the 50th anniversary of the famous Milton Friedman op-ed saying, that the purpose of a corporation is solely shareholder value. This time we surveyed the alumni on the call, and I would say that their views were pretty mixed on that, right? It wasn't, oh, we're just there to make money. I'd love to know what your view is on the issue of what is the role of the corporation.
I agree with the Business Roundtable, and I was glad that they made the statement. The role of the corporation is more than just profits. There are many constituents that a corporation must attend to in order to generate long-term success for the business and for its shareholders. I learned that, and I had a front row seat in that issue and learning it directly from Howard Schultz at Starbucks. That's always been the perspective of the company. Leading through the lens of humanity is what Howard said over and over and over again, and it stuck. That you could actually aspire to more than just profits, and at the same time, in so doing, augment profits by creating an environment where people want to work, where you take care of them. At Starbucks, we call employees partners, where they can be counted on for support like health insurance, which we gave before other companies thought about doing it, especially with part-time workers at the scale in which we did. The way you could bring best practices around the world. All of these things that were things that I learned at the feet of Howard that really took with me for the last 15 years. And it really has given me a perspective, not only that I believe that that is true, but aspire to run Ariel in the same way. We ask questions of the companies that we own, because you want to make sure you have businesses where people want to work. If they don't want to work, if they're not happy campers, it will show up in the results over time. There's no question about it. And so at the end of the day, I think that this idea of shareholder value comes through lots of different aspects of business leadership and a business ecosystem. You have the constituents of the community that you're in. You have the constituents of the employees that work with you. You have the constituents of the customers, the shareholders. There are a whole bunch of people, and we've seen those constituents raise up their hands when they don't like something. The best example that I could give on that, and sorry for such a long answer, is when the Washington Redskins recently decided to change the name of their team and are calling themselves the Washington Football Club. It wasn't some altruistic Black Lives Matter, killing of George Floyd moment. It was FedEx, their biggest sponsor, who pays them $8 million a year for the naming of their stadium, who said, we're out. We can't be associated with this anymore. That was where their change of heart quote came from. Now, I don't say that in a disparaging way, but it just shows the power of all of these constituents and how that can ultimately affect or destroy value.
So you've been, as I had mentioned, on the board, on a number of high-profile corporate boards. What role does the board have in holding the corporate leaders responsible for either making the right investments in the communities, for the diversity of the executive teams? What role have you played? What role do you think the board should play in those matters?
So to be very clear, I think the board has to walk a very fine line. We're not management, and we should not be micromanaging who's in what job, how the organization is run. We should have a perspective around the vision of the leader and a perspective around how the leader is going to execute against that vision on behalf of shareholders. Because our job, we sit in a chair representing, in my case at JP Morgan or Starbucks, millions and millions and millions of investors. And those investors want me to have their best interests at heart. And that's my job every single day. But I do think, in the spirit of being a world-class organization, and I don't use that term lightly, I think, there's that famous line in the book, Good to Great, good is the enemy of great. To be truly great, to be truly world-class, you must be cognizant of all of these issues of your community, issues of diversity and inclusion. All these companies talk about diversity being a strategic imperative. Well, if it is, show me, prove it to me. And as a shareholder and as a board member, I'm going to hold you accountable for that statement. And no empty statements. Because in corporate America, we don't make empty statements on anything else. You can't make generic empty statements about earnings or profitability or anything else that you say is a strategic imperative. So if it is a strategic imperative and you've stated it as so, I need metrics and I need you to hold you accountable. That's not a threat. It's just the job of the board member. So I think the board member has a big role to play in holding leadership in the C-suite accountable for the statements that they make about the business and the direction of the business. And any company that does not think of diversity as being a strategic imperative in 2021, and I've said this many times, is committing corporate suicide. It's not a question of if they will die, it's just when. And it could take a very long time, but it will happen. You can't thrive as an organization without really reflecting what the world looks like.
You touched on this a bit in one of your earlier answers. At Ariel, how do you, when you make investment decisions, think about the success of the companies in building a diverse and inclusive culture? Is that something you give weight to? Do you think about that before you make the investment, or is that something you try to manage afterwards?
We won't not invest with a company. So we won't avoid a company because it doesn't have the diversity that we expect of a leading organization. And let's just talk about our domestic portfolio at this point, in America today. But we will invest and then encourage leadership to be mindful of these issues. And we will be dogged in that encouragement. So we will ask the question over and over again, starting with the board. We want to see at very minimum diverse board leadership, because then we can expect that diversity and that thoughtfulness to start to filter down throughout the organization. It's a top down and bottom up issue when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So we can look back on our 38 years in business, and we could point to over 40 companies where our encouragement and our nudging, etc., led to diverse board members being added to the board. That is something that we think is important. As I like to say, use your power for good. So we want to use our power to affect the change that we think, again, will lead to shareholder value creation by having those diverse voices around the table. I give this as a pretty extreme example. It's not a company we would ever own. It wasn't even a public company. But I say to people, I think probably the Weinstein Company would still be in business if it didn't have an all-white male board. And so think of the value that was destroyed in that business by, of course, very inappropriate behavior. But if there had been women in the room, if there had been diverse people in the room, I think there would have been different outcomes and different levels of accountability for the leadership of that company.
So on today's call, we have a lot of Booth students who are going to be leaders in their industries going forward. As they enter this sort of pivotal early moment in their careers, what can they do to make their workplaces more diverse, more committed to achieving results in their diversity?
They can do a lot. And people always think that it's the leadership that drives that process. And I keep telling people, diversity is a team sport. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a job. And it's not about the hiring manager. It's about your own behavior as well. There are lots of ways to show up in a way that helps an organization be more diverse and inclusive. I use this example from my own firm, that very early in my career at Ariel, we'd be in client pitches. And sometimes I'm with my colleagues, I would literally write a note in a presentation and say, make eye contact with the woman. That my colleague unintentionally wouldn't notice that they were only making eye contact with the man. And you only notice that when you've been the person that didn't make eye contact with you. You see it. And so my being in the room helped us get the account, helped us really help me point out to someone their own implicit bias that they didn't see or know. These aren't bad people, just didn't know. And I felt it was my responsibility to say something because I wanted to win. So that's just a very simple example. I think there are many other examples. I tell people, if you really are committed to this, invite people in your life who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't act like you, and who don't come from where you come from. So what could that mean at work? Making a pledge that once a month you're going to invite someone to lunch who fits one of those criteria, and see what you can discover about them or their life or their beliefs or their culture, and see how that might make you a bit more tolerant or a bit more knowledgeable, intelligent, that move the needle in the way that closer towards what diversity and inclusion is really all about. So it's everyone's job. And I think that if we took that position, I think we'd have a much different society.
You've been incredibly successful in a field, finance, which hasn't traditionally been very welcoming to women, for example. Have you seen the field change? What advice would you give to our students, the women particularly, about entering finance today?
I want to be realistic with that. I think we still have a long way to go. I'm still in rooms where people don't make eye contact with me, believe it or not. Um, and I think that what I like to tell women is they need to be ready for it. And it's interesting because I've used this example many times that when you're a black kid growing up, moms and dads usually tell you what you're going to be up against. Not in a way of creating fear or stoking any kind of drama, just you need to know. And my mom certainly did that for me. What was interesting that I found my very close friends from college who were white women didn't get that same speech. And so they went into corporate America with, guns blazing, ready to go, so devoted to winning and their own ambitions and doing very well, and got demoralized along the way, some of them, when they recognized that maybe the fight wasn't as fair as they thought it was. And it happens over time. And so, we come out of the gate with similar paychecks and the like, but things change when you look mid-career of where women are versus men, where minority women are versus white men, minority men, etc. The gap widens over time. It doesn't start that way. So I would just want to tell all women to be prepared for the environment that they will be in. And I don't say that you should be skeptical or defensive or not trusting, but just be aware. And when the obstacles do present themselves to you, I always say, it's that old saying, when a window closes, find a door, find the dog door, find whatever it is, find another way, as opposed to, as we like to say at Ariel, admiring the problem, because it will happen. I remember once having a conversation with a Starbucks board member, and I was talking to him, Olden Lee, so wise, so smart, former head of HR for all of Pepsi. And I remember talking to him, and I was talking about something related to race. We were sitting in an airport one day, and he looked at me and he said, Mellody, how long have you been black? How long have you been a woman? And I just started crying. I thought it was such a funny comment. But that's just the truth of it. So, okay, so that is. Now what are you going to do? My mom always used to say, you'll be up against this, but I want no excuses. None. And I liken it back. I used this example today with someone. I said that I remember being in a Starbucks board meeting once with Howard Schultz, whom I've learned so much from. And I remember once we were talking about earnings and someone said something about the weather, and he's like, we never, ever, ever use the weather as an excuse for missing earnings. Ever. I don't care if a tornado hit the whole country. That is not a reason we miss earnings. And I thought it was just brilliant because that was my mom's thing. It may be true, but you can't use it as a reason for not succeeding.
I began by mentioning some of the events of today, and I was wondering, just given your role on these boards and just the impact of politics on the country going forward, if you had any thoughts on what happened today and where do you think this takes us?
It's sobering, it's stunning. There are no words. It feels criminal. It feels like sedition. I have to tell you, when you walk around in my packaging, your first thought is, if those had been Black Lives Matters protesters, there'd be a lot of dead bodies laying in the Capitol. And that is my truth. It doesn't mean it's true, but that is my truth. And so it's incredibly demoralizing in so many ways, because all we have is our democracy and our institutions at the end of the day. And to the extent that those things are chipped away, we are lost. And so I take our Constitution very, very, very seriously. And I expect that to be true of all of our congressional leaders and all the people who pledge an oath to our country. And right now, I have to say, I'm just sad and discouraged by some of the political grandstanding in the face of truth. I mean, this is not debatable. And to open up the opportunity for this kind of anarchy and chaos, I think will have consequences that we can't truly understand immediately. And that image of someone sitting in the Senate, chamber in the seat of the Senate president is like, I don't know. I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. So I have to say I sent Jamie Dimon a text because I read his statement that he put out about the importance of our democracy and our society. And all I did was I sent him a text and I said, I'm glad you made the statement. It was very well done. No need to respond. Thank you. So, it takes courage to do that. especially in the face of the backlash that you can get in this kind of environment.
Thank you, and I appreciate you answering my question. Thank you so much, Mellody. So we have a number of questions from the audience. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to bring some of them up to you. Jessica?
Sure. There's a couple of, actually, there's several alumni who are on the call who have their children watching with them tonight as well. So I think a couple of questions came up around that, so I'd like to ask you, start with a few of those. What advice would you give to young girls, young ladies with aspirations to make a big difference in the world?
Wow, that's a loaded one. There's so much there. I have so much to say about that. So I'll start off with this. I have a friend, Pat Ryan Jr. He's in Chicago. He's one of my besties. And Pat and I, when we first met, he's got this really non-traditional life and career. He grew up in Lake Forest, but then became a narcotics officer and started a teacher training corps and is an entrepreneur and just a really good person. And Pat and I once, we were very, very young, starting our careers. And he looked at me and he said, "How long have you known that you were a mutant?" And I looked at him and I was like, I thought about it for a minute. And I said, I was 5. I was 5 years old when I knew I was different from everyone in my family and different from a lot of people around me. And I got really comfortable with that. And so if I were giving advice to young girls today, including my own, who's 7 years old, I would tell them to be really comfortable in their differences and be okay being a mutant, because the mutants are the ones who actually do great things. And I can point to so many of them. And I'm using mutant as just a facetious term, but just being very comfortable being different and speaking your truth. And I always tell people truth is it's with a small t, not facts like numbers or things like that, but your beliefs are a small t, not a big T. Other people have different beliefs, but that doesn't mean you don't hold on to your small t and your truths in the way that are important to you and you don't compromise them. So that's what I would say to young girls: be comfortable being different, and then to be comfortable with their own truth.
Can you speak about the outlook for Ariel more broadly, the challenges and opportunities ahead for active fund managers?
We think active fund management is going to come back in a really big way. We know the passive strategies have seized the day and won for the last decade. A lot of it has been a self-fulfilling prophecy. We think the S&P 500 is one of the most crowded trades in the world. You've seen money pour into that cap-weighted index, which has really distorted valuation and is augmenting the risk that investors are taking unknowingly. They think they're diversified, but when 6 companies, the FANGs plus Microsoft, 6, Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix, Microsoft, one other, when those 6 companies represent 25% of the benchmark, 77% of the returns for 12 months through September, I haven't looked at it yet, through December, you have such uneven leadership. This is such a top-heavy market. We've never seen anything like this ever. Even when you look back to the 1970s, where we had the Nifty 50, which were 50 stocks that were the darlings of the stock market until they weren't, we didn't have this kind of market concentration. And so that concentration means that as the money has poured in, it just bids up these names. I'll give you one example. Apple took 30 years to reach $100 billion in market capitalization. And this summer, it went up $1 trillion in market cap in 21 weeks. So that's what I mean by the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's where we see a lot of risk and danger. And when this comes undone, it doesn't mean these aren't great businesses, unbelievable, wonderful companies, but sometimes great businesses aren't great stocks. And we would see the valuations at this level have made them not such great stocks. And so that jeopardizes the whole passive theme. We think that active managers do better in volatile markets. We saw that in March, and I think we will continue to see it on a going forward basis. Things happen. The pendulum swings too far. I just wrote a letter that I said, beware of swinging pendulums. It will swing back just based upon basic mean reversion. Last point. By virtue of being a benchmark, the idea that is you're in the 50th percentile, you're in the middle. The large cap benchmarks that have become growth momentum benchmark are at the top of the charts and have been for over a decade, that cannot continue.
Do you think the SEC should mandate ethnic diversity in public companies? Company board,
The U.S.
sorry.
doesn't do well with the U.S. does not do well with mandates. I've actually thought a lot about this because there are a lot of mandates in places like Australia and other parts of the world. We just don't do well with it. I don't think it'll ever happen. So, spending a lot of time thinking about it, I think becomes futile. But I do think what the NASDAQ has done by saying that they will delist companies that aren't diverse, I think that is a really interesting statement. I think Goldman's saying we're not going to bring companies public unless they have at least one diverse member. This is where organizations are using their power to move the needle and using their power for good. These are bold statements. The NASDAQ one, they've gotten a lot of heat, brutal Wall Street Journal editorial against them. We actually wrote a letter in their support that we sent into the SEC in December because we actually think this is the right thing. All you're asking is for people to get to some kind of base minimum. And they can have a reason why they don't meet the standard, and they get the opportunity to state that reason. So it's not as if it's impossible to continue to exist that way, but we think it would lead more organizations to do the right thing. We've seen it in other parts of the world, and that's the thing that is so fascinating to me. We're sort of the global capital for finance and money and business, technology. And yet if you look at places like France and the UK and other places where they have 30% mandates and the like, they exceed us in major ways when you look at gender diversity on their boards. In France, it's 40%. In the US, we've just hovered around 20% forever, 19 to 20%. And if you look at minority, the number is well below our representation in society. So when you look at the rest of the world, Norway, I could keep going on and on. We're playing catch up, which is shocking.
You touched on this a little bit before, but do you have any advice on how investors can be more mindful in making stock or mutual fund manager selections while trying to match their own personal beliefs towards racial and gender equality and other social issues?
This whole area of ESG, environmental, social, governance issues that have been overlaid on investment portfolios is hot. It's not going away. I think it's going to be literally, I think it's all the rules are changing in real time as it relates to investing. And I think people are going to expect at a certain level some attention to these issues by rank and file managers, no matter if they purport to be ESG managers or not. They don't want to own certain things. They want to put their money where their mouths are. I personally, for an example, I told our investment managers they can't buy tobacco because I said, I don't want to make 5 cents from a company that sells vaping devices to 9-year-olds. I don't care what kind of profits are attached to that. You can't pay me to kill someone. And so, there are all sorts of different perspectives about this. That might be mine. Someone else might be something else. But I think now we're recognizing that we can decide. And I think especially with the younger people who are watching this, who are in business school or recently out, they're going to have a high level of conviction around these issues. And we as investment managers are going to have to respond in order to survive.
Do you think business and high earning individuals relocating from high tax states to low tax states will be a trend that continues? And what do you think the implications are for places like Chicago?
I think that's actually a really interesting question. Jury's still out. I read a story. Again, these are stories that everyone can read in the Times, maybe a few days ago, that talked about the fact that all these people had deserted New York, especially in the Midtown and higher income communities. Up to 40% of the lights were out in certain apartment buildings and the like, and co-ops. And yet they're seeing these people return. And so I just am not sure if people are going to relocate permanently or not. I think companies will have to be more flexible, including Ariel, and how we accommodate people's work needs. But I don't know if I believe that it wholesale changes everything. Now, when you look at places like Seattle and San Francisco, I think they have real issues around housing and just housing availability and affordability. And that is pushing people out of those regions. And therefore, cities like Chicago, I'm one of Chicago's biggest salespeople. I think Chicago becomes so attractive just because it's a really, really great place to live that most people don't know unless they spend a little time in our city.
Is there a specific business or technology trend as a result of the pandemic that you believe will be the most sustainable for years to come?
I'm really wondering about Zoom and how Zoom will stick or not stick. You could say Teams, you could say WebEx, whatever version of it that applies. But my question is, will we travel in the same way for those early courtship meetings with potential clients, or will that be a Zoom conversation? And I don't know how it's going to work. I think certainly in the early days, I'm not sure a lot of people are going to want you in their office until they're really sure about who's walking in and, you know, all the various pieces of that as it relates to COVID. But just in general, that's the one that I'm really wondering about. Just how do we go back? It feels like it would be ridiculous to go back in the same way. If I use my own work schedule and my own way of traveling, I mean, there were times I would fly cross country twice in 1 week, do multiple red eyes. I think we all recognize that, you know, that's not good for the body. It's not good for the productivity of the individual or in the institution. And so we have to figure out how to work smarter. Plenty of us are willing to work hard, and I'll work as hard as anyone else, but I want to work smarter as well. And I think this pandemic has forced some of that.
Do you have thoughts on how much control, you know, consumers really have when it comes to pushing for increased, you know, diversity in the C-suite or on their boards, and improving sustainability practices in companies that, you know, really drive our economy?
I think they have a lot of control. You know, my husband told me something once that I thought was really brilliant. We were talking about a client request and something, and he's like, Mellody, there's a really simple adage in business, and it is true. The customer is always right. He's like, you need to understand that. And on these issues, when people start voting with their feet, you get pretty smart pretty fast in terms of how you're going to react to them. And I think that's one of the things that I think consumers now see, that they have a lot of power. And especially when they coalesce all of that power together, which our internet and virtual world and social media allows us to do in ways that have never been done before. That's the amazing things about the viral nature of our society, and the brutal, you know, dangerous things about the viral nature of our society. You don't get much time to fix it. So I think that most organizations really do understand that risk exists. And therefore, I think they really want to be quite attuned to especially the controversy, but what the clients want and need from them.
Do you have any thoughts about how you see the healthcare industry changing post-pandemic? There's several questions around the healthcare industry.
This is another one that's fascinating. I've been using this quote that people are shocked that I quote, because I quote Lennon, not John, about, he said, there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And I feel like we've been in this environment during the pandemic where there are weeks when decades happen. We talked about that with, for example, online shopping or digital uptake, all of that, which we've seen in a major way. But I think the other one is going to be healthcare. Because the one thing about the pandemic, we have to deliver drugs to billions of people around the globe. And if you just use America and see how slow this process is going out of the gate, I was talking to someone today and they said, you know, they penciled out how long it could take at this rate. And it's like 82 weeks, the person told me, which is ridiculous because we have the drugs. We will have the drugs. So I think one of the things that will happen because of the delivery mechanism for the vaccine, I think that might lead to changes in healthcare delivery in general. And it'll be fascinating to see how that works. We've seen that happen over time. I mean, 30 years ago, you didn't get your flu shot in your office. And now, of course, we know that that wellness of that employee or the spreading of a virus like the flu inside of a company hampers productivity. And so many employers are more than happy to pay for it and create that opportunity for their employees. So now the question is, what other things we will do? and how we will think about it in ways that we've never thought before, or delivery mechanisms that will be an outgrowth of the vaccine delivery mechanisms that we just haven't even contemplated yet.
This is the last question that you'll get from me, but there's a lot of questions kind of around the tech space. So there's right now a lot of new investment in the combination of ed tech, fintech, and particularly these platforms that are aimed at students. What do you look for when investing in this segment? And, do you have thoughts on supporting the public or private partnerships around this space?
So we don't invest in those segments because we avoid new people doing new things for the first time at Ariel. We feel that that is too risky for our clients' capital. We're trying to buy businesses that have been in place for a long time, who have a history of capital allocation and earnings growth that we can study and understand, as opposed to just rolling the dice on new businesses. There are people who do that extraordinarily well. I have tremendous respect for them. I invest with some of them, but it's not us, because we think that call is too hard to make. I think some of these organizations are really doing some phenomenal things. I don't agree with all of them. Some that have been really hot, especially in the fintech space. I'm very concerned, especially with the gambling nature of some of it. But what I would say is, at the same time, you'd say there's something that's working there. What can we take away from what they're doing right that can augment the delivery of financial services to people and make it less, take out some of the friction? And I think the same will be true of healthcare related technology, healthcare apps, and the like. And so I think there's a lot of good to come. The other thing that I think has not yet happened yet, and I just want to caution people as they think about this, and I'm sure you're a smart student, so has of course already thought about this, but the regulation is going to catch up with these organizations. It hasn't yet. And because of that, this is like the wild, wild west in some of these places. The regulation around these fintech companies is very different than the regulatory environment for JP Morgan. I can tell you that. And because of the size and scale in which these organizations are growing, it is inevitable that it is coming. And when that regulatory environment does come, it can meaningfully change the nature of those businesses.
Thank you, Dean Rajan. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Mellody, I think we're almost out of time. I just wanted to ask you, a last question is, looking ahead, are you optimistic about the future, and at what point do you think we'll be back to, quote, normal?
I'm always optimistic. I love the comment from Warren Buffett, markets are stronger than governments. So even when we have these moments of great strife and sort of head-scratching moments like we had today, I do believe at the end of the day, America has the best system in the world in terms of the capitalist system that we have. And while it's very imperfect, it gets more perfect every day, even though it has a long, long, long way to go. And capitalism does need to work for more people than it currently does. And that's one of my goals in life, to make that possible. So I'm optimistic because of my own life story. And I look at my life and I say it's a miracle that I could be the youngest of 6 kids to a single mom who grew up getting evicted and phone getting disconnected and all of those things, and having gone to Princeton, having married a film icon, having had a wonderful family, having had the opportunity to grow Ariel, having to be in partnership with John Rogers, who's on the board of University of Chicago, who's like my family. There are so many miracles that have happened for me that gives me great faith and optimism for all that can happen for society, especially if we know our history and look back and realize it wasn't that long ago my people were in fields picking cotton.
Well, thank you. I'm deeply grateful that you took the time to share your thoughts with us. It was incredibly illuminating and interesting. Again, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Mellody. This was fantastic. Really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me. Good luck, everyone, and be safe. Happy New Year.